Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 7, Part 3. In addition to circularity, the broader concept we wanted to just cover at a very high level, provide you an introduction to, is something we call degrowth. And this is something that you'll see covered quite a bit in our text for the course, Let My People Go Surfing. But I also wanted to call your attention to a book that's specifically on this topic called Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, by an author named Jason Hickel. And I highly encourage, if your interest is piqued after this brief overview of degrowth and how we need to start to think in new ways about value creation in the outdoor industry and more broadly in the apparel and footwear industry globally and really across all consumer product sectors. I highly encourage you to read this book. And I also put a link to a podcast that had Jason Hickel as a host talking about this topic as well. So if you want kind of a brief overview, that's a good way to get it too. But some of the key concepts here are really linked to our core greenhouse gas impact reduction levers that I showed in part 1 of this module in the lecture on environmental sustainability. So what we're really looking at here is this top lever that we call slow growth. And basically what that's saying is that, even if we substituted out all of the materials that we're currently using for better alternatives, less impactful alternatives. And even if, let's say, the best case scenario occurs in terms of the innovation around new materials and new processes that we're able to come up with to reduce impacts in the industry. And we're really able to account for all of the impact reduction related to changing farming practices, to more regenerative practices. There's still going to be a gap if we continue on with business as usual in terms of the growth projections that we are, typically striving for in the industry today. And this is in particular, this is a challenge across the entire industry, but in particular for publicly traded companies, because CEOs of publicly traded companies have a fiduciary duty in that role to demonstrate growth to their investors. And as we know, growth today is typically tied to extraction of new materials to make new products. So this lever is all about how do we think differently about value creation in the industry? How do we think differently about what it means to grow? How can we grow in a more responsible way within the confines of the capitalist system, frankly, that we have in place today? So Jason Hickel talks about this in terms of a planned reduction of energy and resource use that's designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. So the other way we like to sort of boil this down is by saying it's all about decoupling resource extraction from value creation. And how do we think about alternative ways of, again, creating value as businesses? Because, it's not realistic to say, okay, well, businesses should just, not create product anymore. Let's think about how we can create product in different ways, or how we can create value through rental models, for example, or just lots of other ways of thinking about how a business can operate in a way that's more in tune with sort of societal and environmental needs. So another great quote from Jason Hickel, just talking about the challenges with this topic and implementing this type of thinking within the industry and within the system that we're stuck in today. Degrowth runs against the core logic of the industry. So we need to think about how we can change the logic of the industry. Growth, profit, shareholder returns, these simply cannot be the only bottom line. The bottom line should be human flourishing, beauty, and ecology. That's all that matters. So we need to reorganize the industry around these principles. And another great concept that Jason Hickel talks about in this book is something he calls radical abundance. So having enough, but not having this sort of massive wealth inequality imbalance where, several, corporate heads own, a significant percentage of the world's wealth. How do we bring all of that back sort of into alignment so that everyone has enough, everyone has what they need, but that this imbalance is brought back more into balance, and really making sure that we're in balance not only with society but also with the environment and the resources that we rely on to to fuel our society. So some of the levers that we talk about, one of those levers is the general category of what we'd call carbon pricing. So putting a price on carbon, valuing carbon emissions in a way that adds to how things are valued from a financial perspective. So we're capturing in this type of concept, and these are some different mechanisms you'll see here for doing this, but how are we capturing within the pricing of a product the impact that it's having on the environment? So there are a number of different ways of doing this. An emissions trading system is one. So you may have heard the terminology, a cap and trade system. That's one sort of policy mechanism that can be used to put a price on carbon. A carbon tax is another mechanism. Carbon offsets are something you may have heard about that companies in the industry can use to sort of build in that cost of carbon into the products or their business operations in a way that values it, as part of the cost of doing business. And then I'll skip ahead just to internal carbon pricing. This is another strategy that's been put into place by some leading companies where they're actually saying, okay, within the cost of doing business overall, or even within the cost of creating a product, how do we build in the cost of carbon that's going to be required to create that product, for example, which is super interesting. And again, really a way of trying to get at this idea of full cost accounting. And there's a great Harvard Business Review article about full cost accounting. It's by the founder of seventh generation paper products, Jeffrey Hollander. And it's a bit older, but the content is still really good. So it's just basically advocating for this idea of full cost accounting, or accounting companies being required to account for the true cost of their products, which isn't happening today overall. Really, companies are only showing on their balance sheets, the cost associated with sourcing the different materials, manufacturing the materials, manufacturing the products, the transportation, et cetera. There's no sort of natural capital accounting, or no sort of accounting for the impact that all of those activities is having on the natural environment. And that's the idea behind full cost accounting, which is still an emerging concept, 10 plus years after this article was written, but I think is gaining more and more traction. Other potential levers for degrowth are things like extended producer responsibility or leasing models, particularly for large appliances or larger products. So how this can translate into the outdoor industry is looking at things like perhaps technical performance outerwear, and could there be lease models on those types of products? Or, for example, ski boots. Does it make sense to rent or lease those types of items rather than owning them, and then keep them in service much longer? Extended producer responsibility is really the terminology that's given to policy initiatives that are emerging, where companies will be required to essentially own the products at the end of their useful lives, so that it puts the onus back on the company to design products in such a way that they can either be used longer or have a very clear end of life strategy for them, rather than putting that burden on consumers as it stands today. Mandatory extended warranty is kind of another variation of this. I think the outdoor industry in general does quite a good job overall of having extended warranties and offering really solid warranties on their products compared to other parts of sectors within our broader global apparel and footwear sector. But I think, I think there's probably still more to be done. I think we've all probably had frustrating experiences even with outdoor brands around, only honoring a warranty for a year or two, and then your ski binding breaks right after that, and the warranty's not honored, or a warranty is not honored because a product was modified in some way. Those types of loopholes. How can we, have more of a mind to being more inclusive of what warranties can look like? And then the right to repair is another term that's being used in a lot of legislation that's being proposed lately. I think particularly in the European Union, by the way, this is becoming a big topic of discussion along with extended producer responsibility. But really, this is the concept of consumers should be able to have the ability to repair their products. So why are we, creating, in particular, this is an issue with electronics, planned obsolescence, where, you've got a component that's built into the product versus being able to be swapped out and replaced to be able to keep the rest of that product in use for longer. So all of these concepts are really related to extending the life of products, which is a huge component of making, needing to make less new products if we can keep what's already been made in use and service longer. And then just some other levers, just to summarize some of what is in Jason Hickel's book, just some broader concepts that you might not think about when you think about just this idea of degrowth or creating what he calls a post-capitalist world. Permanent rent controls, minimum wage policy, what's the relationship of a CEO salary to its lowest employee? And is that a metric, that your company can consider embedding in terms of how it does business? So again, we're preventing this massive wealth inequality between the highest paid executives at some particularly larger publicly traded companies. A wealth tax, perhaps, living wage policy that's pegged to a week or a month versus an hourly wage. A 4-day work week is another one that I didn't list out here. Looking at mechanisms around beef and red meat, which are, very high polluting, can be very high polluting industries. Now, I want to be clear with this one that the solution, again, there's no silver bullet solution here. The solution is not to stop eating red meat altogether, but how do we consume less of it? And then also when we are producing it, ensure that it's being produced in ideally a regenerative way where carbon is being sequestered back into the soil and grazing is happening, in a way that's more in balance with nature versus overgrazing and all of those things. And then, as mentioned earlier, taxes or sort of a cap and tax system on resource and energy use. Again, just suggestions that he has in the book. Some of these may seem somewhat radical, but it's just really a thought starter to get your brains thinking about different ways of doing business, how we can think about this really key lever to achieving the greenhouse gas impact reduction and other impact reduction that we need to see across the industry by 2030 and beyond. That's not going to happen without paying some attention to the amount of new product that we're pumping out currently as an industry, and how do we look at that in a more thoughtful way, while also ensuring that businesses can still make money in some way and be good actors in society. And then, of course, any discussion of degrowth or rethinking value and rethinking growth rates. Within the outdoor industry, we have to mention Patagonia and their Don't Buy This Jacket campaign from 2011, Black Friday 2011. This was really one of the early, I would say, advocates for this idea of buying less, keeping what you have in use longer, making that direct linkage between the amount of product that's being produced and purchased and environmental impact in particular. And so, again, just saying it's not enough to be able to switch out, virgin polyester for recycled polyester in the case of Patagonia in particular, but we also have to really have a think about how much product we're producing and the impact that's having overall, which is significant, as shown. One of the really key levers to achieving the climate targets we need to see. So that's just a brief treatment of degrowth, rethinking growth, rethinking value in the industry. Hopefully that's a useful overview on this rapidly emerging and increasingly important topic for the industry.